So we'll go ahead and get started. I'm going to turn it over first to Beth Jarash, who is a senior research associate at PRB and a longtime user of social media, especially Twitter. So Beth not only maintains her own Twitter feed, but she also manages the Twitter feed for our coordinating center at Pop Research Centers, as well as the Twitter feed for the Southern Demographic Association. So without further ado, let me turn it over to you, Beth.
Thank you, Linda. And my understanding is that there's a wide range of skill sets among the people who are participating in today's training, everything from people who are active social media users or active Twitter users in particular already, to those who are really new to this and don't have a lot of experience. And so I'm going to start out very basic to make sure that we all have the same terminology that we're working from. And I'm actually going to sort of treat it as a biology class. We're going to dissect a tweet and talk about all of the different parts so that we have the same terminology moving forward and I don't lose anybody as I talk about the rest of it. But I'm also framing this in the larger perspective of why is it even important to use social media? So sort of top 10 list style, the top 10 reasons to use social media for social science. And so hopefully I will teach some sort of new tip or trick to those of you who are experienced users. I'll give you some preliminary guidance and some ways to get started for those of you who are new users, and for those of you who've been using Twitter for as long as I have, which is, I think we're going on 10 years now. If by the end of this, I haven't given you something new, if you haven't learned anything, use the Q&A and ask me questions, because there's a bunch that I wasn't, for time trimmed out of this talk. So let's start with the anatomy and terminology. So what you see on the screen here is a tweet, and let's break down what pieces you see. At the top, you see a name and handle. The sort of dark bold lettering is the name, the PRB, and that you can change at any time. Mine is Beth Jarris. One of the trends that's going around on Twitter right now is to add a hashtag in the middle or add a wear your mask at the end of your name. So that you can change on a regular basis. Your handle, that at part, the at PRB data, like your email address, that stays constant. And that's the way that people can find you. They can reach out to you. They can tag you in tweets, and that you can interact with people. And then on the top left, you see the avatar. It's the little image that people see in their Twitter timelines that sort of give a visual cue about who's sending the tweet. Underneath that, we have the body of the tweet, and you'll see that there are parts that are in black and parts that are in blue, and we'll explain each of those. The black part is just basic text. It's what are you saying? Underneath that in blue, we have a couple of different pieces. There's a piece here, and hopefully you can see my mouse when I do this live. There's a link, and it could be just a regular hyperlink. It could be a shortened hyperlink, which is what you're seeing here. And so if someone clicks on that blue piece, it's going to take them to the article. And so the difference between the black and the blue is that black is just text. There's no interactivity. Blue is something that you can interact with. You can click on it and it does something. And the link is the most straightforward. It just takes you to that website. The next chunk that you see are hashtags. Those of you who are new to Twitter, you've probably heard of hashtags before, but a little bit about the way that they're structured is the pound symbol is at the very beginning of the hashtag, and then the hashtag includes any text that follows that pound symbol up to the first space or first punctuation. So you can't have a hashtag that includes a period or an exclamation point or an apostrophe in it, because those characters symbolize the end of the hashtag. So we see two here. There's now hashtag National Baby Day and hashtag 2020 Census. I'll talk about how hashtags work more a little bit later on, but just know that if you click on those, it's sort of like a quick search feature. It brings up all other tweets that have used that hashtag. And then underneath that are handles. So we talked about the handle at the very top that lets you know what account has created this tweet. You can also include handles in the tweet itself, and that's what tags the person and lets them know that you've talked about them or you've referenced them in some way. We'll talk more in just a second. Underneath that, there's an embedded image, GIF, or video. So this can be, there's a GIF repository that is within Twitter, and you can search through those and add funny photos or relevant clips to your tweet. You can upload your own photos, you can upload your own videos, you can link to videos. All of those help sort of make your tweet sort of stand out among the masses. And then underneath that, although I don't have it tagged, there's sort of the name and date stamp, or I'm sorry, the time and date stamp. And then at the very bottom there, when you click on a tweet, there are 4 options there are 4 actions that you can take. The farthest left that looks like a little comment bubble is a reply function. If you click on that, it allows you to respond directly to the person who wrote the tweet about that tweet. The next one over to the right that you see in green here is a retweet. That means that you have retweeted that to your timeline and anyone who follows you will see it. The third is the heart or like button. If you click that, it lets the person know that you have appreciated their tweet in some way. And then the final one here on the end is a direct message. And so instead of retweeting it so that everyone sees it or replying so that everyone sees it, you can also direct message a tweet to somebody. So if you have something sort of constructive criticism, or you want to share something that you think is funny, but it might not be something you want everyone to see, or everyone to realize that you have as dark a sense of humor as I do, you can use that direct message feature to share that with one individual or with a small group of individuals. So I talked a little bit about how we use handles, and I said that if you put a handle in the text of your or the body of your tweet, it tags that person. And what that does is it lets the person know that you've talked about them in some way. They will get a notification that they've been tagged. The tweet also should show up in both your timeline and the timeline of the person who tagged, and the whole world can see the tweet if they search for it. If you, on the other hand, put that handle at the very beginning of the tweet with no spaces, no punctuation, no text in front of it, it shows up only in the timelines for people who follow both accounts. And yes, you can find the tweet if someone searches for it, but it's a little bit less, the whole world sees it, a little bit more direct conversation between those two. So basically, this one is less frequently used. I would highly encourage, if you're going to tag someone, keep those tags toward the end, or one of the techniques people will use is sometimes they'll put a period before they tag somebody if the syntax, the sentence structure doesn't make sense to put it later on.
So Beth, we've got one question
Sure.
about creating handles. So
Mm-hmm.
the question is, do you recommend using your name or something that is more anonymous, like, let's say, @DataGeekB?
That's an excellent question. So do I have one? I think that there's a little bit of an art to that. I find that when I started Twitter, I used sort of an anonymous handle and did not use my full name at the beginning until I realized that I was using it in a professional way. I did want it associated with my name. So I think there's a little bit of personal choice there. Truthfully, the likelihood that your individual name is going to be available is probably, I have a household with people who have names like Rich, so those names were already taken. So a handle that's creative can be helpful, and then you can use the name part of it to put your full name, and that's one sort of clever way of doing it. You can use parts of your name, you can use something that's totally unassociated with your name, and then for your handle, and then use the name piece to let people know who it is. Once you've picked your handle, you're stuck with it for a very long time. Change it unless you create a new account. And so some thought going into what you use for that, I think, is important. Being a data geek is something that I've always associated with, so that one worked for me. PRB data works for PRB data. I think Mark is probably happy with his handle. One other thing to keep in mind is that the longer your handle is, the less characters it leaves for other people if they're including you as a mention. So like Pop Association America is one of the longer handles. And so every single one of those characters in the handle takes up one of the 280 characters that people have to use when they're writing about you. So just the shorter if you can keep it short, that's good. Okay. Any other questions that came in we should take at this point?
Nope.
Okay. So let's get into, so that's sort of background and some of the logistics of how Twitter works. So let's talk about the top 10 reasons to use Twitter, and use this as a way of talking about strategy. So my favorite reason, and I suppose this could have been the number one reason to use Twitter, is to stay current on latest developments in your field. I find Twitter far easier to follow and to curate than a messy desk full of the latest articles that are out in demography, all of the funding opportunities that are out there, job opportunities, the news articles, relevant pieces of content that, there is a large volume of information out there, and you can't keep it all on your desk. And so Twitter is one nice way to keep track of all of those things. And a little bit of an advanced feature and way to curate that, in addition to following people who are posting relevant content, following funding organizations, following other research institutes to see what other people are doing. You can also keep track and curate those lists through a Twitter list feature. So if you're on Twitter, on the left-hand side in the nav bar is an option called lists. Click on that and click create a list. It allows you to create curated lists of accounts. They can be topical, they can be colleagues, they can be people you met at a conference. You can use any sort of organizational structure you'd like, but once you create a list, you give the list a name, you describe what that list does or who's in it or what accounts are in it, and then you can choose to make it a public list so that other people, if they're also interested, for example, in sourdough bread starters and all of the interesting, Twitter handles that are tweeting about sourdough bread, you could make the list public. Or if it's something like you're job hunting and you don't want your employer to know that you're looking at other institutions, not that any of us would ever do this. And Linda, I am not, I promise. But you can make it private so that you're the only one who sees it. Maybe you don't want all of your colleagues to know that you're interested in sourdough starter. And so you can make it a private list. Once you've created a list, if you go back again, click on once you've created one, click on this lists option in the left-hand nav. It brings up the lists that you personally have created or owned, any that you're subscribed to, and lists that you're a member of. So other people can add you to lists. I know a couple of demographers who have lists of lots of sociologists or researchers who are working on family planning and public health and reproductive health. So you may be a member of lists, or you may be subscribed to other lists. Once you have lists that you have curated, I want to be really clear that you'll see two pieces here. You see the avatar, the name, and the handle of that list that you own. So this is from the CPIPR account. I've created a list called Population Research. If I click on this little avatar or any of the piece here, it's just going to take me to my profile for that account, to the CPIPR profile page. So you want to be careful and click on the list name itself. Once you do that, it brings up all of the latest tweets, all of the people or all of the accounts that you have in that list. So the CPIPR Pop Research Centers, there are 20 Twitter handles, 20 Pop Research Centers around the country that are NICHD funded that have Twitter accounts that I know about, that I have on a list, so that I can go through every day and see what are each of those centers posting, what should I retweet, what should I help boost, what should I know about, are there new funding opportunities from NICHD that I should know about and share with the group. And a couple of people have subscribed to the list as well. So they also have the ability to click on that list and see the latest information coming out from those centers. So it's kind of a neat curation tool. Another way of searching through or combing through content or helping to curate it for yourself is using hashtags. I know that there is a demography instructor who has created a hashtag for her class, and every time she sees an interesting article, she'll tag it with the hashtag that she created for her class so that her students know to go and read that article or read the tweet. There are a couple of hashtags that are particularly in common use in demography and in population research. The hashtag PopTwitter, hashtag SocTwitter, and to a lesser extent, hashtag EpiTwitter. And if you are in a tweet, you can click on, or if you see the hashtag, you can click on it. You can also search for the hashtag in your search bar. And if you have an announcement that you think people should know about, you can tag it with that. So if you've got a new funding or sort of new postdoc position that's open in your research, if you have a new publication that you want to talk about and you want people to know about it, tagging it with PopTwitter is a way to expand the number of people who see it beyond just the people who are immediately following you. Oops. So when you're using hashtags, they can be really beneficial, but I would say use them judiciously. If you remember at the very beginning, we saw the black text and the blue text. If you put too many hashtags, it gets visually, it's hard for the eye to read through that many characters with no spaces in between them, or that much sort of long strings of text. So a couple of hashtags is usually sufficient for a tweet, or if you're going to use several hashtags, split them up so that you use a hashtag in one place and some text and then hashtags in other places in the tweet. They are really great for tweet chats and for live tweeting conferences. So tweet chats are an organization or a researcher decides they want to talk about a particular topic. They let other people know to use the hashtag. And so they may post a question or post some comments, and other people interacting with that hashtag can be following that discussion thread by following what other tweets are getting posted using the hashtag. They're also really great for live tweeting conferences, and I will talk specifically about live tweeting later because I think it's a really key way of using Twitter for social science. The one thing about hashtags that I will say is if you're going to launch a new one, which we'll do at some point, check and make sure that the hashtag isn't already in use or isn't already in use for something that you don't want to be associated with. So my favorite example happened several years ago. The first time we were doing hashtags for a conference for SDA was 2016. And we were thinking, well, SDA 2016 would be the perfect hashtag for this conference. And found out that it was also the Soul Drama Awards and the Salão de Automóvel, the Brazilian car show, and there were thousands of tweets with really glossy images about all of those things. And so if our conference of 150 people had used SDA 2016, literally nobody would have seen any of the tweets about the conference. It would have been overwhelmed by these two other glossier, flashier, more participants things. So we ended up going with SDA 2016 Conf instead, and it worked great. So moving from conferences, one of the other neat things about social media is that it's far less awkward than in-person networking. And I'm saying this as someone who actually really likes talking to people. I tend to be an extrovert. I like that interaction at conferences and meeting new people and sort of the get to know you kinds of talk. But I also really love the way that Twitter works, because when you've met someone for the first time, there's always that question of what do I ask about? How do I get to know this person? With Twitter, the other person has already shared something. They've shared some interesting research finding. They've shared their thoughts on a current event. They've shared their favorite birding photos. And so that gives you the opening to respond to that in some way, to comment back, or to, to retweet or like or interact. And it makes it far less of an icebreaker and much more of an ongoing, flowing kind of a conversation. So how do you engage on Twitter to do that networking piece? First of all, you can share new publications or resources. You've got a new paper that's just published, share it. You've got a book that's out, share it. You're doing a book tour, share it. One of the most common questions I get when we do this training is, the feedback that, well, that feels like self-promotion. It feels awkward. Should I be doing this? Of course you should be doing this. Everyone else is talking about their work. That's why we're here on Twitter, because we want to hear about what you've done. We want to hear about your research and your book and your appearance on CNN. So share it. That's what it's there for. News items that feature your research. So you were interviewed about a current events topic. Share that. Links to blog posts, videos, and talks. Share those. Questions that invite feedback. This is less sharing and more moving into the interactive. So when the pandemic started, it also happened to be 2020 census time, which is near and dear to me. So I asked a question, who got their form in the mail? Who danced around the living room when it arrived? It's sort of a lighthearted, like, let's talk about something other than the news for a change. And it got a lot of engagement because I follow a lot of demographers who are also really excited about the 2020 census and then share their photos of themselves smiling with their 2020 census forms back to me. Interesting news, photos, or visuals. If someone's done a really great visualization, be something cool in New York Times or Washington Post or other, sort of data journalism site, those are really great to share because telling a visual story with your tweets can be a really useful way of using it. Reply or retweet to other people's tweets, and then share thoughts on conferences you attend. And with that, I want to talk a little bit about live tweeting. So we talked about hashtags. If there's a hashtag for your conference, tweet about it and use it. You can share everything from a photo of a poster that you thought was really great and some information about why you thought that those research findings were interesting, to where are the best donuts within a 2-mile radius of the conference location, and follow along, because it's a really great way of, maybe you bumped into a person at a session and then you keep that conversation going and build that network by talking about the donuts or the other posters that you saw, or asking questions about their research that you didn't have time to ask in Q&A.
So Beth, one other question here, which I think is a good one. And the question is, I find it intimidating to share thoughts and discussions that I am used to having in small private settings in the open and that will never disappear. from the wire. Any thoughts on how to overcome this barrier?
I love that question, and I think I'll answer it in a couple of slides from now, or at least I'll provide my thoughts on that, or perspective or way to think about that, and then we can come back to it at the end if that's okay.
Absolutely.
Okay, so commiserating about reviewer 2. I don't know if any of you, like me, has ever gotten a review back from a journal article that you've submitted where it's clear that either the reviewer hasn't read your paper, wants you to cite all of their research and not anybody else's, wants you to totally blow up your research question and start all over again, or just basically dumps all over your work. It happens. And when it happens, it's because that person was reviewer 2. And Twitter is a great way to commiserate about those horrible, horrible reviews from a reviewer 2. So it's one of my sort of a cathartic moment when you get one of those terrible reviews. Another way of using Twitter is to find inspiration. I know that we all have the occasional DIY fail where you see something great on Pinterest and it doesn't quite work out the way that you expected it to when you get it home. Thankfully, Twitter for research isn't quite that way. Both of these articles, and there are hundreds of them, but these 2 articles in particular, I know started out with a tweet. The researchers who are published here saw something that they thought was interesting, tweeted about it. That tweet became a tweet thread explaining what they already knew about the topic. Those tweet threads, in one of the cases, turned into a blog post that then evolved into a research project and a journal article. The other one went straight from the tweet thread to research and a published journal article. And along the way, because it started out on Twitter, both of these researchers were getting feedback from colleagues and responses to, well, hey, had you thought about this other article that was posted? Don't forget to, cite this person's work, as a much more interactive way of building these sort of research processes that ended in published papers. I shouldn't say ended, because then were shared back on Twitter and had a life after that, but the research projects led to published papers. And that leads into that you and your work deserve an audience. You're doing really great research, and someone other than just the people who live in your household or your closest friends and neighbors should read it. And one of the sort of stories I often tell about this is, I don't know how many of you know Jess Clarko, but she's got a couple of books. I mean, this is someone who's got a robust research and publication background. But when the college cheating scandal happened, would CNN have known to find her to interview her about her work? And the answer is, before Twitter, probably not. But because she has an active presence on Twitter and regularly talks about topics, social stratification and higher education, it was much more likely that CNN was going to find her for that interview. And I think this happens all the time. I know for a fact that this has happened in my own career, where things that I've been the sort of expert on, journalists or elected officials and others, have found the work because of social media. Questions from trolls are a good practice for dealing with reviewer 2. And it's sort of a light way of thinking. And I'm going to talk a bit more about how to deal with negative feedback that you get. But I would say keep in mind the idea that challenging questions that come in, trolling questions are a different issue, but challenging questions that come in from colleagues can help you improve your research. They can help you refine your thesis. They can help you find other work that's already been done and make sure you're citing all of the latest literature. So that the give and take generally I've found to be very positive. In the cases where it's not, it doesn't necessarily mean it's all bad. Critical feedback can help make your work better. Also, and I think this is where we start to get into that question about how do you engage in public with research questions and things, where you're used to having smaller discussions with a smaller group of colleagues. In part, there's an imperative, there's a responsibility to share what we know with the public. Many of us have work that's funded by public funds, whether it's the federal grant or a state or local pool of money. And in accepting public funds to do our research, there's sort of this imperative to then share the information back with the public, share it with the public, share it with the media, share it with elected officials. And so social media is an important part of that dialogue and a part of that sharing platform. And so there's a responsibility to share the work that we're doing. But the one that I think probably answers this the most clearly is a review essay that Phil Cohen wrote a couple of years ago. And it's a book review, but it's the first book review I've ever read that was actually a call to action. So he was reviewing a couple of books communicating for social sciences, and specifically addresses this shift from public sociology, where we're doing sociology about the public, to doing sociology in the public. That it's not just about getting our ideas out there and sharing them through press releases or through books, but it's also getting new ideas in here, getting feedback from others, and to a certain extent, not shying away from controversy and being okay with the fact that ideas live in perpetuity, but also that doesn't mean that you can't evolve, that you can't, learn new things. And to a certain extent, you can delete old tweets if you absolutely have to, if you find that it's sort of the tweet didn't age well. But I would highly recommend reading the article or the review essay, Public Engagement and the Influence Imperative, if you're sort of questioning that, where do I draw the line between sharing my work or doing engaging in this public Twitter social science sphere versus the model that we're all more familiar with, which is that one-on-one. And with respect to controversy, this is one of my favorite quotes. And if we were all together, I probably wouldn't read it, but since we're online, I'm going to. The only sure way for scholars to escape any and all controversy is by doing unremarkable work, or work that's so inconsequential or impenetrable that it's incapable of ruffling anyone's feathers because so few people care about it or understand it. So we're all doing research on topics that matter to the public. And would family planning and reproductive health matter if there weren't public policy debates about it? No. Would incarceration rates matter if there weren't public policy questions to be answered? No. Would, if everyone agreed, then there wouldn't be a reason to do the research and to sort of try to tease out what's best for society or what's the most ideal way of tackling a social problem. That's why we do this work. We're not doing work about questions that have already been answered. We're doing questions that matter today. And because they matter, there will be people who disagree with you. I started my life in local government, and we used to joke that in any issue, we could be suggesting giving $20, like out of our own pockets to someone, and there would be between 5 and 20% of the population who would just think it was the most terrible idea they would ever heard and would refuse the $20 just on principle because they didn't like the idea. Every issue has a small proportion of people, no matter how good the idea is, they are going to be against it. And that shouldn't be a reason to shy away from sharing our thoughts and sharing the good work that we do. So all of that said, what are some tips and tricks for engaging? Use graphics, photos, or videos. There are billions of tweets out there. Using something visually eye-catching is a great way to stand out from the crowd. Keep it short but accurate. You want to keep your comments pithy, but not so short that you've sort of implying that there's an association between things to claiming that there's causality that's been proven. I probably don't need to say that to this group, but brief is good as long as brief is still accurate. Think of your audience, who you can't entirely control who's seeing your tweets, but when you're crafting them, think, do I want this to be read by the general public? Am I writing this to other researchers? Am I talking to my colleagues? Do I want this to be seen by a journalist? And that'll help you figure out what tone you should use, be timely and relevant. If you've been doing research on isolation, if you've been doing research on Medicaid, if you've been doing research on health disparities, those are all really relevant right now, and you should be sharing work that you've done. It doesn't mean that you necessarily need to do a whole bunch of new work just because something's in the news cycle, but work that you've done that's relevant, absolutely at any time you can be sharing that work with the public. Include a call to action. And by a call to action, I mean everything from call your elected officials or write your congressperson or the Federal Register notice about data access in this particular program. This is important to our work, to read this article, retweet this thing. So a call to action to suggest that someone should do something really helps increase engagement with your tweets. Stay consistent by posting frequently. Even I, who understand how the algorithms work about how other people see my content, did not realize how much my Twitter presence would drop after I took 2 weeks off last summer. It was sort of shocking. So I'm not saying you need to be on Twitter multiple times every day. I am, because it's part of my job. But checking in a couple of times a week is a good way to start, to sort of get a sense of who else is out there, to be engaging with them. Ask questions. Ask questions of your colleagues. Does anyone know of any research related to XYZ? Does anyone know of a tool that I can use to track my submissions across multiple platforms? Or, you know, what tools do you use for citations? The questions are great because you've got thousands of people who might be willing to help you answer them. Crowdsourcing works great. Participate in live events. We talked specifically about live tweeting already. Experiment and use variety. Here, I would say, you know, try things out and you'll eventually find your voice, but also be willing to branch out beyond just, hey, here's an interesting research article and post a link. Be willing to talk about other things that are of interest to you, in part because you want to be yourself. The people who I engage with the most as colleagues on Twitter are the ones who share both their research and also their birding photos and their anecdotes about their children at home while they're trying to teach an online class. You know, it's that keeping it real, being yourself, I think is an important part of the Twitter experience. And so how do you find your tribe? How do you find the people who are sort of you're most interested in engaging with? Look at conference hashtags, see who posted, and if they're posting about things that are relevant to your research interests, that's one way. Once you find some people who are active in your area of interest, see who they're following, and then click on those pages, see what those people have posted for the last couple of weeks, and if that's of interest, then follow. You can always unfollow somebody, they won't ever know. Use the lists feature to curate specific interest areas and engage thoughtfully. So I talked about how we can deal with trolls. Also, we don't want to be the troll, so constructive feedback is great, being mean is not. And also, if someone is the person who's trolling you, keep in mind that those are often bots, they're often not human. And so my best advice, if someone's giving you a hard time, and it does not happen that often, but if someone is giving you a hard time on Twitter, you know, block and ignore, block and ignore, block and ignore, unless the person is harassing or has violated the terms of service in some way, in which case I would say block, ignore, and report. Block, ignore, and report. Twitter takes, there's question about whether or not Twitter takes violations seriously, but there have definitely been cases where I've gotten accounts suspended because of their inappropriate responses. So that feature can work. And so last but not least, the best reason to use Twitter is to lift up people in stories. Talk about your own research. Talk about the great poster that your research assistant presented at a recent conference. Share stories that are coming out of your institute. Share the work that your colleagues are doing, and engage in a thoughtful way. All right, that's mine. Linda, do we have other questions that have come in?
No, so we're going to switch to Mark so we make sure we have enough time for his slides. So what we're going to do now is switch gears a little bit, because when we talked to Matt about the content for this session, he also mentioned that many of you might be interested in a few tips on how to work with journalists in addition just to using social media. So Mark Mather, who is my colleague and associate director of our coordinating center here at PRB, has been working with journalists for probably close to 20 years. So he's going to share some of his tips and his experience on the best ways to work effectively with journalists. So Mark, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. And Linda, can you see my screen?
I can.
Great. So this is peak bird migration season, and I am a birder, so I thought it was appropriate to use this particular metaphor to talk about journalists. And so I'm going to briefly describe, in hopefully about 10 minutes of time, some tips and potential pitfalls in talking to journalists, and then we should still have some time for questions. So how can you identify a journalist in the wild? First, they are on short deadlines, so they do have a story to write. They want to write it quickly. They might have 1 or 2 days. So if somebody does contact you and wants to write a story, it's good to get back to them quickly. Second, I know that lots of us tend to avoid conflict, but for journalists, conflict is really their main business model. So they like change, they like reversals, they like findings that tend to challenge conventional wisdom. Third, they they want to hear about the bigger picture and the historical context. So to the extent that you can help put your work into the broader perspective, that will be a big help to them. And then fourth, many of them have lost their jobs recently because, as you know, many newspapers have been shutting down. So the media landscape has really been changing dramatically. And the effect for me has been all of the journalists that I used to work with, say 10 or 15 years ago, have either retired or they've been laid off, or they're no longer covering just population issues. They might have shifted into politics or some other beat. So it can be a very difficult business for them. So who are what kinds of journalists are out there? There are lots of different varieties. I think print and online journalism are maybe those that we're most familiar with, and maybe the most straightforward in terms of giving interviews. But the challenge, I think, with online outlets is partly that they're just proliferating so rapidly. It's kind of like pigeons in the park. So not all of these online news outlets are trustworthy. And at PRB, we do get a lot of requests from organizations, news outlets that we've actually never heard of before. So it's good to do a little bit of detective work before you talk to those folks, just to find out who you're dealing with. TV and radio, that really takes it up a notch, because obviously you should do a little bit more preparation for those kinds of interviews and have your talking points really well prepared. Recorded interviews are generally pretty easy to do, because if something doesn't come out right, you can just say, hey, can we stop? I just want to say that in a slightly different way. But keep in mind, if you are doing this kind of a broadcast interview, they might just really want that one quote that supports their story. So I've done sometimes 30 to 45 minute interviews, or recorded interviews, where what ended up on the news was a 5-second soundbite. And that's true with radio, not always, but sometimes. And it's even more true with television. So you might just actually be on screen for 1 or 2 very short scenes, even though you've talked to this person for an hour. Live interview is something that scares many people. So if you are doing a live interview, either on TV or radio, it's good to really prepare in advance, have your talking points down, know exactly what you want to say. And hopefully you can talk to the journalist or the producer in advance to find out what questions they're going to ask. And I will actually sit down with Linda if I have an interview coming up. I will often sit down with Linda and we'll go through the talking points just to make sure that everything sounds good. One other tip is that I have tended to avoid call-in programs. So this is where you have a host of a program, but they are allowing call-ins from listeners. Public radio is generally okay, but there are other call-in shows where you really are not sure what you're going to get. They should be screening the questions that come in, but you can get some pretty off-the-wall questions that can be hard to answer. Freelance writers and bloggers are becoming much more common. So I've talked to many of these kinds of writers recently who they might be basically writing for another news outlet, and newspapers are increasingly relying on those kinds of folks to get their stories. Data journalists are also more common now. So it used to be that we were the experts, we had access to the data and the tools to analyze those data, but increasingly they really don't need us as much as they used to. They can conduct their own data analysis, and they might need our help in interpreting the results or making sure that they did it right. But increasingly they can really do this on their own. The nice thing is that there's a potential for collaborating with those folks. So if you've done some interesting analyses, especially if you have, say, some county level data, you think it would make a very nice map. There could be a news organization that's interested in publishing that map and writing a short story based on the results. And then scientists as journalists, this really gets back to what Beth was talking about. So you have the option of just bypassing the journalist altogether and taking your work directly to the people. And Twitter provides a nice platform for people to do that. So here are just a few quick tips for talking to journalists. And most of this is pretty common sense, and some of it it's a nice segue from what Beth was talking about. Prepare your talking points in advance and run it by a colleague if you can. Tell a story and set the context. So start with the big picture and then tell them how your work fits in. Make a key point. When you're conducting the interview, make a key point and then allow time for questions. So this really should be a two-way conversation. You want to get to your main findings pretty quickly and then let the journalist take it from there with some questions. Use numbers sparingly. So the word about is your friend in these interviews. So you could start a conversation with about one in five families. That would be a good opener rather than burdening them with too many detailed statistics. Provide examples when you can and use metaphors if you can do so. So if you have data for counties, it's useful to them if you can mention one or two counties that really illustrate your point, or mention your hometown to personalize it. So on many occasions, I've talked about my grandmother because I do get a fair number of calls about population aging. My grandmother lived to be 107. So whenever somebody has a question about healthy aging, I tend to work her into the conversation. Try to anticipate their questions in advance. So some common questions you can expect to hear are, why does this matter? What does this mean for X, Y, or Z? Were there any surprises? In terms of that last question, it's a very common question that I get from journalists, and it can be a tough one because you're the experts, you already know all of this stuff, so you may not have been that surprised, but put yourself in the shoes of someone who doesn't know the content matter and try to think about what might be surprising to them. It could also be useful to talk to Columbia's Office of Communications and Public Affairs. Many universities' public affairs offices can help with press releases, they can help set up interviews, they can help with social media, and so on. And then the ultimate goal here is really to build a positive relationship with these journalists and become a trusted source. Because once you've gone through this process once, it's likely that they will come back to you the next time when they're writing a new story. Okay, avoiding potential pitfalls. Early in the process, as I mentioned just a minute ago, it is useful to do some due diligence and to check fairly early on to see if this is really someone that you want to talk to. So if you start a conversation with somebody and it's clear that you're not comfortable with the premise of the article, just tell them that you don't think you're the right person for this interview. You could refer them to somebody else or just let them know that you're not interested. And so I do generally, if I don't know the organization or the news outlet, I will look them up in advance and try to look up some of the things that this person has written before. And I have declined interviews if I don't think it's a good fit. It's good to respond right away when you do get a request for an interview, even if you can't talk until tomorrow or later in the week. If they don't hear from you right away, they will typically just move on, try to find another expert that can help them. And then don't say anything that you wouldn't want to appear on the front page of the New York Times, because once you've got a quote out there, you never know where that might end up. It's really not a good idea to go off the record or to make sort of off-the-cuff remarks or speculative comments that could get you into trouble. It's okay to pass on a question. If you don't know the answer, it's better to not try to guess what the right answer is, but rather to just say that you don't know the answer. And again, you could potentially refer them to somebody else who could help them. You want to avoid passive voice, jargon, acronyms whenever you can. Try to be conversational. So pretend that you're talking to your family or friends and just having a discussion. And then finally, focus on your findings, not on your methods. So in some cases, the methods are the story, but it's more likely that they're interested in your key findings. So you don't want to go through to talk to them like you're describing your research paper, where you start with the hypothesis and the methods and then get to the findings at the end. You really want to put those findings up front because that's probably what they are most interested in for their story.
So Mark, there are a couple of questions here which I think you've sort of touched on, but I'm going to mention them now. So one of them is, how about answering the question that you wish they had asked? This is a common experience for people who do interviews with journalists, and
Yeah.
Matt said, often I get asked questions that shows the journalist doesn't completely understand the topic, which is understandable, but can you reframe? What do you do?
Yeah, you can either reframe or reframing is kind of an art, and that's why it's important to have your talking points available in advance, just to make sure that regardless of the questions they ask, you're going to tell them these key points that you've already identified. But secondly, I would say any good journalist at the end of the interview will ask you, are there other things that you want to tell me? Are there other questions that I didn't ask you that we should talk about? And even if they don't ask that question, there should be an opportunity to provide that information during the interview. So don't let them control the entire conversation. If they're asking the completely wrong questions, it may be that this is just not an interview that you should be doing.
And related to that, I think I might be on an upcoming slide, Mark, but is it okay to ask journalists to review any attributions before they're published?
Yeah, that's a tough one. So you mean just actually reviewing, letting you read the quote back to you, or look at their story in advance?
I think it's just your quotes.
Yeah, you can often have them give you the quotes that they're planning to use. They often won't give you the entire story. Sometimes they'll actually give you the entire piece, especially if it's an exclusive. They will often do that. But if you ask, they will often be fine with at least giving you back the quotes that they're planning to use, so you can and they're usually perfectly happy to edit those if it's not exactly how you wanted it to come across.
Okay, thanks. Go ahead.
Okay, well, this is the last slide, and it kind of comes back full circle to what Beth was talking about. This is Twitter is a really great resource for communicating with journalists. It's a great way for journalists to find you. It allows you to control your message. It allows you to connect with journalists after an interview. So after a story comes out, you can retweet that story. You can add additional comments. And if they're writing stories that are relevant to your research, that's another great way to connect with them. You can say, this is a great article, and here are some other key findings that I found in my research that are relevant to this narrative. And I just provided one example here from Adam Sakarni at Columbia, who does a really nice job here, hits a lot of the points that Beth had made. So he's connecting to a journalist at the Washington Post, Christopher Ingram, about an article that he wrote. And then he's kind of complimenting him on that piece. He's got a visual here, a map, which is going to increase engagement. And then he's also being collaborative. So he's kind of lifting up a colleague's work, Jeremy Kahn, and kind of hits all of those key points that Beth was trying to make. So I will stop there, but I am happy to take any other questions.